I'm Sarah, 32 years old. I work for a company, but I'm currently on parental leave. It's been about 4 months since I gave birth to my daughter, and I'm starting to think about going back to work. On the other hand, it seems that my husband Sam hasn't really come to see himself as a father yet, despite the birth of our daughter.
Sarah, you're not going to quit your job just because we had a baby, right?
That's what Sam said right after the birth, when most people would offer words of appreciation. Not just me, but my parents, who were there, also showed signs of concern at his words. I'm just glad she was born healthy. Let's talk about work once things have settled down a bit. Unable to stand the look on my parents' faces, I quickly changed the subject. We've been married for 3 years, but Sam's odd behavior didn't start recently. It's been there since we got married. His quirks that I used to find funny and charming when we were single have become one of the causes of my fatigue now that we're living together. My husband probably makes a lot of mistakes at work as well, as he seems to get reprimanded by his boss frequently and often looks very depressed when he gets home.
I might not be cut out for this company.
Once he gets like this, nothing I do helps. He spends the rest of the day looking downcast. But it seems that he forgets about it by the next morning, as he's usually cheery again. Are you okay now? You looked really down yesterday. Even when I voice my concerns, he leaves for work as if nothing had happened. Sam has a very volatile personality and tends to make impulsive decisions. And although he doesn't seem to realize it, he often misunderstands things and jumps to conclusions, which frequently leads to mistakes. But since we got married, there's one thing I've come to understand about him. That is, he thinks his mother's opinion is absolute. Sam and his mother are unusually close, which surprised me when we first got married. I wonder if it's because he's worried about his mother, who lost her husband and now lives alone, that Sam still visits his parents' home every day. Sam has one older brother, but they don't seem to get along. And when his brother got married, he didn't even discuss the possibility of living with their mother, which really upset Sam at the time.
I have to take care of Mom. It's a shame she was abandoned by my brother.
This is the reason we live near his parents' home. Although I was prepared to live with Sam and his mother, surprisingly, his mother did not want to live with us. You two should live your own lives. I find it easier to live alone. Despite what she said, Sam still decided to live in an apartment just a stone's throw away from his parents' house because he was worried about her. Living at a distance where he can be called upon at any time and only asking for help when she needs it is very convenient for my free-spirited mother-in-law and has more advantageous than living with a stranger like myself. At the time, I also thought that living near my parents-in-law was the best option, but now I often find it a nuisance. I might have caught a cold. I can't move because I feel so sluggish. Sarah, can you make dinner? She often calls me during work with such requests, and not only to make meals but also a large amount of laundry is dumped on me, saying she is fatigued and has back pain. Moreover, it is always me who my mother-in-law asks for help, and I don't understand why Sam goes to his parents' house every day and doesn't help out at all. But when I complained about this, Sam said firmly,
Isn't that your duty as a wife? Besides, I can't do housework.
His words were as if our marriage was just an excuse to get me to look after his mother. Deeply disappointed me. My love for my husband, now that I think about it, may have gradually cooled since then. My mother-in-law, who calls me every day to take care of her, surprisingly never complains directly to me about the housework I do. However, there's not even a single word of thanks. I always feel angry about this. It seems like my mother-in-law thinks it's natural for me to do the chores at her house, and she only complains about my cooking to my husband. My mother-in-law, who was only interested in my husband, shows almost no interest in me. When I announced my pregnancy, she didn't react much. However, when my husband told her about the pregnancy, she was jumping for joy, so it seems like she's only cold towards me. In fact, my mother-in-law already has 2 grandchildren, but she hasn't seen them even once because she doesn't get along with our older son.
Our child will be like the first grandchild for Mom. She'll be so happy when the baby's born.
I was taken aback by my husband's words, which seemed like he was looking forward to his mother's joy more than the birth of our child. Even so, I still believed that once our child was in front of him, his interest in his mother would fade. But even when our child was born, my husband talked about money and work before expressing any emotions towards our daughter or words of appreciation to me. My husband has always been a spender, and I often worry about his shopping habits, especially the large amounts of fitness equipment he bought online, which I never saw him use. I had to dispose most of it when I started my maternity leave.
Hey, I was planning on using that. Don't just throw stuff away without asking.
I spoke to my angry husband as gently as I could. We're having a baby soon. We need to be careful with our money. Despite my calm words, my husband sulked and wouldn't talk to me for several days. Since I was going to be taken care of by my parents after my first childbirth, I went back to my parents' home. The day after, I got a call from my husband.
Sarah, what are you doing? What about my meals? When are you coming back?
I had told my husband several times that I was going to my parents' house after I had the baby. I couldn't suppress my irritation at him for saying such things the day after I was discharged. I told you I'd be staying at my parents' house for a while. You can do your own chores. If you can't, ask your mother for help, or you can go to your parents' house. When I, who was upset, spoke in a strong tone, my husband said with a sulky voice,
Of course, Mom is at our house every day, but she doesn't do housework, and she gets tired of the food I buy every day, so she tells me to make something.
I was so flabbergasted that I couldn't find the words to respond. Considering my mother-in-law's immense affection for my husband, I naturally assumed she would take care of him while I was away. What an unexpected development. Ever since then, I've been receiving daily SOS calls from my husband. Fed up, I decided to return home once with my father. What we found was our home looking like a pigsty, even though it had only been a week since I got out of the hospital. Despite clearly foreseeing this would happen again, my father disposed of the trash, and I prepared meals for a few days. In the evening, I contacted my husband, but he didn't even say thank you, instead asking,
When are you coming next?
I was so angry at my husband that I couldn't help but yell. Aren't you ashamed that you can't even do things for yourself? My father had to clean up all that trash. Seeing me hang up the phone in anger, my father, looking worried, said to me,
Sarah, is everything going to be okay with raising your child and dealing with Sam? From what I saw today, it seems like Sam doesn't do anything around the house.
I felt pathetic being able to confidently say everything was fine in response to my father's question. I hadn't said anything to avoid worrying my parents, but I couldn't hide it any longer, so I told my parents about my husband's usual behavior.
You can come back anytime when it gets tough,
my parents said. Since my daughter was born, I've been frustrated with my husband's behavior and feeling down. My parents' words were very encouraging. I need to work hard for my daughter's sake. Just thinking that I have a place to rely on gave me strength. Returning home after a month at my parents', I became painfully aware of how tough it was to balance household chores and childcare. I didn't expect help from my husband or mother-in-law from the start, but on top of doing everything by myself, I was still being burdened with chores from my in-laws' house. One day when I brought my daughter to my in-laws' house to prepare dinner, I left her with my mother-in-law. But when my daughter started crying, "Stop her crying quickly. Why do I have to babysit?" she said, without trying to soothe my daughter, and pushed her back to me. In the end, my mother-in-law didn't even touch my daughter on her own. It seemed that she was not good with babies, Amidst this, my husband suggested,
"It's been about 3 months since the birth. Isn't it time to return to work?"
and I started to think it might be time too. Considering the household expenses, returning to work earlier would be reassuring, and it would also be better for my workplace not to take a long leave. After all, the money we had saved for living expenses during maternity leave was about to run out. Most of the money my husband earned was gone, spent on things like health equipment and his other wasteful expenses. I had wanted to use the birth allowance for my daughter, and I knew that the child-rearing leave benefit would not be deposited until sometime after application. Therefore, I had created a new bank account before giving birth and decided to manage the money for my daughter separately. One day when I went to the bank to check the remaining birth allowance, I couldn't find the bank book. Of course, I haven't used it since I opened the account. The only person who knows I have it here is my husband. As I thought about it, I couldn't help but suspect my husband. At the beginning of my maternity leave, my husband had asked me when I was preparing for hospitalization.
"I'm not the one who pays for the childbirth expenses, right? They're paid by the municipality, and there's no money I have to pay for myself, right?"
My husband, who knows nothing but how to waste money, seemed to be worried that I would run out of money while I'm in the hospital and wouldn't be able to pay the hospital fees. "It's fine. The insurance association will pay when you are discharged. If you need money for the birth, use this account where I deposited the birth preparation money." At that time, without thinking deeply, I told my husband where the money was. But could it be that he used the bank book without my permission? I intended to clearly tell him that the money was for the childbirth expenses, but knowing my wasteful husband, there was no telling what he could have spent it on. As soon as my husband came home from work that day, I confronted him. "Hey, I can't find the passbook where I deposited the funds for childbirth preparation. Do you know where it is?" I was dumbfounded by my husband's words, who, without any hesitation, responded to the inquiry.
"Oh, I gave all that money to Mom. After all, it's money I earned, isn't it? I'm free to use it as I want."
I, who had thought that Sam had wasted the money again, couldn't even imagine that the passbook had been handed over to my husband's mother. "That's the money I saved for our daughter. It's not money you earned." My husband, hearing this, showed no response and continued to eat. Seeing this, something inside me snapped. I confronted my husband with the divorce papers that I had been preparing for something like this, and while holding back my anger and tears, I said, "Please sign. I can't live with you anymore." Although Sam seemed a little surprised, he signed without arguing. Honestly, I had thought of hating the divorce depending on his attitude, since I had just given birth. But seeing him show no signs of regret, I made up my mind. I left the house carrying my daughter and the luggage I had prepared for an emergency. Looking at my husband, who was silently eating without even a glance towards us, it seemed he didn't even care about our daughter. Reflecting on my difficult life so far while watching him, I vowed to myself that I wouldn't let things end this way. When I returned to my parents' home, I immediately filed for divorce and headed to the police station to report the abuse. My money, which I had saved, was used without my permission, which was undoubtedly a criminal act. Even though I might be told it's a marital issue if my husband had spent all of it, I decided to explain to the police that it was actually my mother-in-law who had used the money. I was too frustrated to just let this go. Rather than wanting her to be arrested, I filed a police report out of a strong desire for my husband and mother-in-law to sincerely reflect on their actions. A few days later, I suddenly received a frantic phone call from my mother-in-law.
"Sarah, the police are here, accusing me of stealing your money. I don't know anything about this."
She seemed flustered, and it was hard to understand what she was saying, but I believe that's what she was telling me. On the other end of the phone, my husband seemed to be there as well, and I could hear him shouting something.
It's all my fault. Please, forgive me.
I don't know anything. I didn't take any money.
I responded politely to my mother-in-law, who was crying out on the other side of the phone. All I did was report to the police that the money I had saved for my daughter's birth was missing. Upon hearing my words, my mother-in-law was surprised and suddenly fell silent.
What? What does that mean?
Without saying anything more, the call disconnected. A few days later, I was called to the police station to discuss the situation. According to the police, due to the domestic nature of the issue, it was difficult to treat it as a case. Apparently, my husband had indeed given the bank book to his mother, saying,
"It's money I earned, so you can use it however you like."
And my mother-in-law had withdrawn the money, knowing it was in my name. The bank account into which the passbook was transferred not only contained the remainder of my maternity benefits, but also gifts from my company, amounting to nearly $10,000. The security camera at the bank had clearly captured my mother-in-law processing the withdrawal. The police told me that my husband seemed to be regretful and promised to repay the full amount. They suggested that perhaps I could withdraw my complaint, considering this was a domestic matter. Indeed, my reason for filing the complaint was to have both of them reflect on their actions, so I decided to withdraw the report as the police suggested. But then, why did the police visit them? I was puzzled. However, the situation changed dramatically, and my husband and mother-in-law were arrested. While I was away visiting my parents, my mother-in-law had tried to borrow money from a credit card company using my ID card illegally. Although she failed to borrow the money, it resulted in attempted fraud, so my mother-in-law was immediately arrested when the credit card company filed a complaint against her. And my husband, being the closest to my mother-in-law, was also arrested on suspicion of involvement in the incident. Why was my mother-in-law so desperate for money that she would try to borrow money under my name or rely on help from my husband? When I looked into it, it seemed that my husband's wasteful spending habits were similar to his mother's, and she was as careless with money as to borrow money from various places. When it became too difficult to repay with just her pension, she thought of borrowing money under my name while I was away. However, because the ID card has a photo attached, it was impossible for my mother-in-law to use it, so this matter ended up being an attempted fraud. It was thoughtless, to say the least. My husband, who hadn't helped with the illegal use of my ID card, was quickly released, but he seemed to be unable to live a normal life, worried about his mother who had been arrested. I understand him being concerned about his mother, but first and foremost, I want him to work hard to repay the money he stole from me. Despite this, since I can't trust my ex-husband, I've asked a lawyer to deduct the repayment amount from my husband's salary. I've heard that my husband is on the brink of bankruptcy due to the debt repayment for himself and his mother-in-law, but the only thing I want to avoid is the stop of repayment to me. After some time, a police officer who had taken care of me in this incident came to visit. I felt a sense of familiarity when we met last time, but upon talking more, it turned out that he was my classmate from my student days. He seemed to have been concerned about me since that incident and came to check on me today. "It's been a while. I didn't recognize you at all. You've become a respectable police officer," he replied with a little embarrassment. He replied a bit shyly,
"Has anything happened since then? Actually, I recognized you as Sarah right away."
And that day he visited me several times, but his excuse that
"I'm not here for work"
was somewhat amusing. As we talked several times, I learned that he was also single, and I felt that this reunion was gradually turning into love. Maybe this time I should be the one to go see him?